now going to start into the section of the PAB standards that historically I believe has been one of the most confusing part of the standards, confusing part for programs to understand and demonstrate what they're doing, and then finally confusing for site visitors to evaluate or assess what the program has done and what they should have done in order to satisfy the meaning of the standards as they are written. So I want to start off outside the realm of accreditation. I just want to talk about this concept called, what is outcomes assessment? And I want to contrast it with what many of us, old people in the room, have done in terms of saying how great we are in the past. I would say things like, my faculty are very good. They are very highly credentialed. They are award winners. They have published lots of articles that have been cited lots of times. I'd say my students were really good. They had average GRE scores of this, GPAs of that, came with this type of experience. I would say our program has put together a curriculum that makes sense, that flows. One course feeds into the other. We even went so far one year as to have coordinated assignments among core courses in the first semester. We have great space. Students get to interact. We get to bring in professionals. It's all working great. We're a great program. There's not a single outcome of the program in anything I just said. They are all inputs. Great faculty, great students, great curriculum and its logic, good space. Oh, and I neglected to tell you that we're pretty resource rich too. We got a lot of money to provide help to students to bring them in. Those are all important and key ingredients to producing what we want to produce, which are the outcomes that you intend to achieve. From an educator's perspective, those outcomes are a set of learning goals or learning outcomes that you want your students to have by the time they graduate from your program. You want them to be able to do X, be able to apply B, to demonstrate C, to defend E. And you do that through the opportunities and perhaps constraints that you may have. So your opportunities are your great faculty, the good quality students. Constraints might be we just don't quite have enough space, but we do the best we can with it. How do you achieve your outcomes? What is your process that you use to achieve those outcomes? How do you help students learn? Curriculum and its logic is your process for student learning. And what did you actually achieve? What did the students learn? The old saying is, you know, if you build it, they will come. Back in the day for economic development, but stolen from Field of Dreams movie. If you have great faculty and good students and a good curriculum and good space and you're well-resourced, will students learn? Probably, but there's no guarantee. If you have crappy space, a good curriculum, not nationally ranked faculty, good students, not great students, and you are under-resourced, can students still learn? You bet. So you want to be able to find out what you actually achieved and then make a determination of what you could do better. Can you make a shift to the curriculum? Can you identify more opportunities for students to practice something that you want them to learn better? So, forgive me, but while I was sitting at home thinking about this portion of the presentation a couple of weeks ago, it just hit me, the analogy. And maybe it was because I had buffalo wings on my mind coming to Buffalo, I don't know. But I came up with this analogy. We want to produce a great meal. And continuing on with this metaphor that I've been using, the great meal is the students learning and being successful practitioners. That's the great meal. Okay. Well, we've got a bunch of ingredients. Okay? Those ingredients are your faculty, your students, your space, your resources, and your process by which you create the great meal from those ingredients is often through recipes, which in this analogy is your curriculum, the opportunities you provide to students, the style of teaching that you employ. So you have resources, ingredients, that you put together with a recipe to produce a great meal. Okay? What can go wrong? Well, you can have bad ingredients. Remember what that analogy is? You can have a bad recipe with great ingredients and still not produce a gourmet meal. You can have a great recipe with bad ingredients and get closer to that gourmet meal, but probably not. So you're really talking about the interplay of these three items. And when you think of outcomes assessment as being that, it is the shift from the traditional thinking of I'm good if all of my ingredients are good and I have a good recipe. But that still doesn't guarantee the gourmet meal. Trust me. How many of us have had failures trying to produce a great meal with great ingredients and a great recipe, and it just didn't quite get there? Okay? So let's carry this on a little further. So what outcomes are you intending to achieve that gourmet meal? What opportunities or constraints might you have? Well, it's ingredients, it's time. How did you achieve your outcomes through a recipe? What did you achieve? What was it? What was the flavor? What was the quality? What was the aesthetics of that meal? What could you do better? Well, you could do a different recipe. You could actually follow the recipe. I have a friend who consistently takes great recipes and modifies them and is shocked that it isn't the same. And it's like, why is that shocking? Okay? So maybe you follow the recipe. Oops, sorry, excuse me. Maybe you have, maybe you have better ingredients. So when we think about this now, when we start talking about learning, student learning, the analogies go forward. You have student learning outcomes. That's what you're trying to achieve. And you define those yourself for your own program. You then have opportunities and constraints. You have faculty, you have space, you have resources, you have teaching ability, you have quality of students, all of those things that are in the refrigerator. How do you achieve those outcomes? Well, through your curriculum, through your faculty expertise, through your teaching effectiveness, all of those process-based things, that then you actually measure what you achieved. And you can do that by looking at what students are learning, what they achieve, what their career success is. All of those are potential measures of how well your program is in producing that gourmet meal. And then, to make this an important part of accreditation, and why we focus on any of this to begin with, is what could you do better so that students learn more and better? Well, you can revise courses, you can make curricular adjustments, you could have better activities for students, you could coordinate assignments among courses in a given semester so that material is actually reinforcing. All those sorts of things are the types of recommendations that programs would make for themselves after looking at this and critically examining what they've done up here. So, that's outcomes assessment in general. That concept of ingredients, recipe, meal, quality, what could be done to improve it the next time you make that recipe. That's outcomes assessment as the analogy. For accreditation, there are two types of outcomes that we pay attention to. And these come not only from specialized or professional accreditors like planning, but they also come from the regional accreditors and from the Department of Education and from the Council on Higher Education Accreditation, CHIA. And those two sets of outcomes that are of importance in an accreditation process is, first, are the students learning what they will need for planning practice? Because accreditation in planning is about planning practice, preparing students for planning practice. And that is measured then by compliance with the PAB standards, which is why you go there and assess their compliance with standards. Secondly, there is the notion of strategic planning. Are programs themselves improving? We all can identify 3 or 4 things that we wish we had in our programs back home that would make us better. Now, some of those are within our own power, others are not. But have you identified what those are collectively through a process of engagement, a strategic planning process? Have you then set forward a path to achieve one or more of those objectives that you've identified? Have you achieved those objectives, and what would you do differently? It's the same thing. You know you need better ingredients in the fridge. Your recipe's fine. How do I get to better ingredients in the fridge in order to have that gourmet meal? And that's at the level of whether the program itself is improving, as well as whether the students are learning. Okay? That makes sense so far? Are we all tracking on the same page? Okay. So why do we assess both program improvement and student learning outcomes? Well, because it's important for us to monitor the progress of programs in meeting their strategic goals. Do they want their does a particular program say we want our faculty to be more productive scholars? Or maybe we want them to be more productive in terms of student credit hours delivered. Whatever that is. If we define that as a program goal, then we should monitor the progress of programs in meeting that. Maybe it's about quality. Maybe it's about contribution to profession and knowledge. Maybe it's about service to the community. It could be 100 different things. And in most cases, it will be 100 different things that you think you could do to become a better version of yourself. Or the program you're reviewing could become a better version of itself. But then you have to make it a strategic plan and figure out what do you have within your control that will have the biggest impact on improving your program. So in addition to programs meeting their strategic goals, we're interested in identifying the learning of students. Do they have the knowledge, skills, experience, predispositions, and values by the time they graduate to go out and be successful planning practitioners? And by the way, by successful planning practitioners, that may mean they go on to graduate to a PhD program. That's a successful practitioner in this context. And then most importantly, on why we assess these outcomes is not just to document what we're doing, but is to close the loop and make continuous adjustments and improvements to both our strategic plan as well as how students are learning, how and why and where students are learning, okay? That's why accreditors care. It isn't because they're mean and they're evil and they're trying to make this all hard for programs, and it isn't even, although it's related to the whole thing that's been going on in higher education for the last 10 to 15 years about it's not worth what you pay for it. We're not holding universities, therefore departments and programs within it, to high standards, yet the price of higher ed is going, that whole narrative that's going on right now is in fact what led to some of the accreditors saying, well, let's at least document this so that we can get those folks off of our backs, or demonstrate to them that we are in fact achieving things that are important for our students and for our graduates. But where the accreditors come in is to say, but you need to have a process where you're examining those results and making determinations on how you're going to get even better or make improvements. So I spend a lot of time on this portion because I think it is misunderstood. And maybe at some point in the future I won't have to talk about inputs versus outcomes because that language will go away. But I know, and I'm going to pick on some people who I know are old like me, old-time accreditation documents used to say, tell us about your faculty and your students and your curriculum, and therefore we're just going to assume that you have great products and do good work with no assessments of the actual student accomplishments or the program's accomplishments. And that focus now away from inputs, to outcomes, with understanding that the inputs are critical to the outcomes, but it's the outcomes that matter. If you offer a great program and have great resources, that doesn't mean your students will learn. Okay? And that has been, in fact, a radical shift in higher education. It was a radical shift in my own teaching. In another session that I have at times done for ACSP, I've actually shown an old syllabus of mine where I said the purpose of this course is all of these things. And therefore, you will read this book, you will do these assignments, and I will grade you based on this. In other words, if I do what I promise, which is to show up in class and give you lectures, have you read the book, and have you do assignments, I'm just going to assume you're learning because I'm so good, right? Now the focus is on the reason why I'm having you do this assignment is because it's a mechanism that I can use to measure how well you've learned this key learning outcome that's now on my syllabus. It's no longer the purpose of the course, it's what a student will learn in this course. What I want you to learn, by the time you leave this course, you will learn something, something. And the reason I give you that policy memo is I get to assess your writing, which is a key element to the learning outcomes for the course. And I also get to assess whether you got it, the concept behind that memo. So it's not just work for work's sake, but it's work for the student to understand how that helps the student learn or demonstrate their knowledge, their learning of a key course outcome. Okay. So it's kind of a culture shift, it's a sea change. All of the new faculty that are coming up through higher education and into our programs are so used to this. This is what they teach them in how to teach courses when they're in graduate school, all of that stuff. They get it. It's us old folks that need to try to make that cultural shift and move forward. So, what are your responsibilities as a site visitor with regard to outcomes assessment? Well, your responsibilities are to understand the distinction between what a program says it wants to do to improve itself through strategic planning and the student learning outcomes. And those are contained, both of those concepts are contained in Standard 1, PAB Standard 1, and we'll break those out. Secondly, you need to evaluate the efficacy of those goals and learning outcomes in the context of the program's mission. If they say they want to, in their program improvement, that they want to become a great research institution with all sorts of writing productivity from their faculty, but they're teaching 4 courses a term, that's probably not going to work in terms of their mission. Okay? Other of your responsibilities and roles will be to examine the outcomes identified and figure out if they're realistic, whether they're based on the mission and they address the PAB criteria. And you'll see those criteria in a few minutes here. You'll review the assessment plans for both the program as well as student learning and review to make sure that they have measures that are appropriate and valid, that they are collecting data, that they've done the analysis, and they've identified the feedback mechanisms to make improvements. You'll also examine ways in which they have measured their outcomes, both for their own program improvement as well as for student learning. And then you'll identify how the program has already used or intends to use the results of these assessments. So you're not going to go in and write the program plan for them as a site visitor. You're not going to tell them what their learning outcomes should be. They generate that. Your job is to make sure that they're appropriate, that they're context specific, that they include the same set of things, and that they've actually assessed them, those outcomes that they want, both student learning and program improvement outcomes, and they've used those results of those assessments to figure out what they need to do differently, or whether to just pat themselves on the back and they've done a great job, keep doing it. So that's your role as a site visitor and your responsibility. So remember, there are 2 types of outcomes that we're looking at in outcomes assessment in accreditation. There's one that has to do with program improvement. Those are my words, not the words of the standard. And then there's student learning outcomes. So let's hit program improvement first. This is under Standard 1. It is, in fact, 1A, B, C, and E. And basically, here is the standard A, B, C. We're going to hold off on D. That's the next phase. And then E. Public information is, we'll capture a little bit of that here. So, the standard says, and it literally, whether you like it or not, it's going to force a program to do strategic planning. Because it's going to say, what was the results of your last accreditation review and your prior strategic plan? What did you say in your last plan and your last review? What does your current plan say? In other words, if they're the same as before, we probably have a case where nobody's been paying attention. Okay? Then we're going to do a programmatic assessment. We're going to ask whether those goals in your strategic plan have been worked on, measured, analyzed, and reported. And then, based on those, you're going to establish strategic issues for the next 5 to 7 years for your program. And that's the current logic of this standard. Those of you who haven't studied the standards, although all site visitors will have studied the standards by watching the videos, right? Yes. Yes, thank you. This new logic makes so much sense because it puts first and foremost the programs need to state who it is and what it does, how it wants to be better, how it's going to get to being better, and what it's actually done to get better, whether it worked, and what's the new focus based on both the program's view of itself as well as the context around the program, the institution, higher education in general, planning practice, whatever that larger context is. Okay? So just in terms of the standards 1A, B, C, and E, A is what were the issues, priorities, actions, what did you assess, and what progress have you made from the past? Therefore, what is your current strategic plan with its goals and measurable outcomes? How participatory was the development of that plan? Because nothing new here. This is planning, by the way. This is what we teach our students to do. Then, here's this assessment that we're going to do, what the work plan is for assessment and what activities we use. What are the benchmarks, the time frame, the actions, how we've assessed those outcomes that we're looking at here, and then what does that mean in terms of actions or revisions, and then that sets us up for the strategic issues for the next 5 to 7 years. Things we haven't achieved, things we hope to achieve, things we wish we would achieve, and then how we become a better version of ourselves. So what is a program strategic plan? Well, it's based on your mission as the program. You have a mission. So what is its purpose and reason for being? Okay. Its vision is that aspirational statement about the future of the program and its graduates. And then the goals and objectives are specific items, actions, outcomes that you want to achieve, and your work plan to achieve them. And I'll give you an example here in just a minute. So program mission typically has 3 elements associated with it: teaching, research, service and engagement. This teaching typically is to achieve student learning and success, and we'll come back to that because we're going to talk about student learning outcomes. Research and outreach, it can be whatever the program decides it wants to do. Help students learn research skills, inform practice or advance knowledge, understand planning issues, whatever your mission statement says about your program or the program you're visiting. Service and engagement, contributing to communities, provide opportunities for there's all sorts of things, but typically programs' mission statements include something about each of those 3. They don't all. And most of them have some end goal they're trying to achieve. You know, a just, equitable, and sustainable society. I've seen that more times than I would know what to do with. And programs who are serious about that mission will set up aspects of how they organize their program, the faculty, the students, the teaching, all of that, to achieve those and can actually measure it. They'll also have student learning outcomes that are related to just, equitable, and sustainable futures. So your mission statement often will include both your student learning outcomes as well as your program goals, but it's who you are. And remember back from Module A about accreditation, purpose, and process, when you go on a site visit, you are suspending everything you know about your own program. You are going there and reviewing the program based on its mission. Not your mission back home, its mission. And so a clearly stated mission is critical to a good site visit and useful accreditation review of the program. Given its mission, vision, context, resources, distinctive characteristics, oh, by the way, those are all the words we use for strategic planning. Okay, given those things, what are the program's future goals? Which ones are strategic, how to become even a better version of itself? Necessary, in other words, the dean has said if you don't get your enrollment up to X, you're gone. That's not strategic anymore, that's necessary. Okay, and I make that distinction, that's my distinction, because a lot of people say, well, if the dean tells us we have to do this, is that strategic? Well, what do you think? Of course it is. And aspirational. It may be, you know, in 10 years if we get here, wouldn't that be so cool? And then what are your plans to achieve those goals? What are the outcomes associated with those goals? Specifically, what are the performance indicators or measures that you will use to assess those goals? What's the benchmark? What's your target? What's your time frame? What personnel and resources will be needed for you to act on that? That's what a strategic plan and its related assessment, outcomes assessment, can and should look like. So let's do a quick example. Let's say a program goal is, the dean has said, currently your enrollment is 20 students enrolled in your 2-year master's program. Yikes. You want to get to 40. The dean has said, if you're not at 30 in the next 5 years, you're gone. Now, no dean would be that direct, even though that's what they're thinking, trust me. But they'll say, you know, we really have to work on enrollment. Enrollment's really important to your program. You know all these budgetary, blah, 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 blah. But that's what they're saying to you. Okay. Why did they pick 5 years? I think that's probably in their minds a good planning action horizon. It's also a good planning action horizon for what we do in education. It's hard to make change. Our cycles are all based on a year. So anything we do in 1 year, we won't see the outcome until the next year, and then you know how that works. So that's probably a useful planning horizon. So now you have to get 10 more students in the next 5 years. How are you going to do that? Well, it may be, and this is an example drawn from my own particular background, is that we're going to increase the number of applicants we want to get from our own institution. One way for us to increase enrollment is to target our own undergraduates and try to get them to enroll in our master's program. Okay? With the logic that the more applicants, the more enrolled students. That's the logic. Because look, what I'm working on here is applicants. It's not enrolled students. But there's logic behind there. Second might be to expand our market area for recruitment. Again, looking at more applicants leading to then enrolled students. Third might be retention. First to second year retention. Maybe we're losing 2 or 3 students out of those incoming 12 each year. Why are we losing them? What are the factors that are leading to them leaving? And is there anything we can do as a program to help prevent that? So if we have a student that enrolled in year 1 and comes back in year 2, wow, that's 100% retention. If I have 12 and I lose a quarter of them, now I'm down to 9, and to get to that 30, or even to 20, I have to have an entering class of 11 or 12 just to deal with that. But if I retained them all, those 12, I'd have 24. So just by working on retention, I can increase my and that's the reason why one would look at retention. Plus, they're already there. It's probably cheaper to deal with them after they're there than it is to try to get them there to begin with. Okay? So what are the benchmarks for your measurable objectives? Now, you've already set your goal at 30 students in 5 years. Now you're going to establish benchmarks for your measurable objectives. So I said I wanted to get more applicants from my own institution. Well, now I'm going to specify I want to double the number of applicants from my own institution for next fall's entering class. So in the past I had 6, I want 12. For objective 2, I want to establish working relationships in 2 new recruiting areas by spring of 2020. So I'm specifying what I need to do on my plan. And then I want to improve my year-to-year retention rates by 5%. Okay. But that's making you say what you need to achieve. Now, truthfully, you could do all of this and it has no impact on your enrollment. Right? But at least you're working on it. You're not just sitting around wringing your hands saying, oh my God, we've got to get to 30 in 5 years. How are we going to do it? Magically, the gods will come down and do that. And oh, by the way, with the exception of perhaps maybe some travel, there's no resource expenditure here, necessarily. So this is where the dean says, you will get to 30 new students, and it won't be by me giving you 10 more graduate assistantships. It's now, you'll get to 30 students, and we're not changing your resource base, because you're underutilizing the resources you currently have. Okay? So, from an outcomes assessment basis, we're going to look at what your methods are for evaluating your progress and making improvements to your plan. So what evidence do you have to assess the achievement of those goals and measurable objectives? What were your results on those measurable objectives? By the end of spring 2020, you should be able to document how many more applicants from your own institution you got in fall of 2019 and assess that against that measurable outcome and your target there. You should know how many new institutions you've established a recruiting relationship with in market areas, in target areas that you want to go to, recruitment areas. And then what happened? Did you see an improvement in the number of students who applied? Did you then, perhaps by the fall of 2020, see improvement in the enrollment? Then you ask the hard questions of yourself and your faculty. Did we achieve success? Are we making progress at least? Do we need to revise our approach? Do we need to just keep doing it because we're seeing some good things happening? Or do we need to scrap the whole thing and start over? Okay. That's how you can take a strategic plan, and most of them that I've seen are 3 pages long, with so many goals and objectives, no one would know where to even start to work on that strategic plan. But you're going to take that strategic plan and say, what one or two things? As a program administrator, you'll do this, and as a reviewer, a site visitor, you'll look at that plan and say, wow, what one or two things should we be working on this year? How are we going to work on them? What's our plan of action for achieving that new goal and its measurable outcomes? And how will we how will we gather information about the results of that work? How will we review it collectively and make a determination about whether we're on the right course or not? And then rethink for the next year. So a lot of us have 5-year strategic plans that are 2.5 pages long, and 90% of what's on that strategic plan will end up on the next strategic plan, right? Because we didn't get to it. And that's okay, because you're documenting the things you want to become better at. But you can also set up each year, and I would suggest as a former program administrator and dean, is that at the beginning of the academic year, your faculty say, these are the things we're going to focus on. Or better yet, you do it at the end of the previous academic year, and that gives you, as the program administrator, time to get your ducks in a row for the following academic year while you're there over the summer, if you're paid over the summer to be a program administrator, and think about these things. So, makes sense? There's no rocket science here, but it's important. And often not documented in the way accreditors want you to, and frankly, the way you expect your students to do it when they establish a plan. They need to get down and dirty. They just can't say, we need more green space in our community. Well, how are you going to do that? And where? These are the outcomes that must be reported as required by the Department of Education and the Council on Higher Education Accreditation for all programs that are accredited. Graduate satisfaction, graduates of their institution. What is their level of satisfaction with the institution? This one is pretty unique to planning, but it's service to the community and the profession of your graduates. So as a program administrator, you're thinking, how do I capture that information if I don't keep track of my alums? Interesting. Which is going to be, as a site visitor, probably one of the things you will say most often. You need to keep better track of your alums. Student retention and graduation rates. These are monitored and kept by your institutional research office. Graduate employment. What's the percentage of employment of your graduates within 6 months or a year? I don't remember what the standard is. Certification rates, when you become AICP certified or certified in something else that's appropriate to the mission of your institution, in your program, and then these strategic planning related measures that we just talked about. So those are things that must be reported. And then the last phase of this section on program improvement is how does the program then establish a process by which that strategic plan is revised, refreshed, disseminated. What new plan is needed because of not meeting your strategic goals? How do you revise the plan due to changed circumstances, whether they are internal or external? Internal, faculty turnover, retirements, negative tenure decisions. How does that affect your circumstances? And then define how frequently you will revise your strategic plan, what approach you will use, and whose responsibility is to do what to revise that plan. Okay? And remember, 1A is prior strategic plan, 1B is current strategic plan, 1C is program assessment of your strategic plan, D is student learning outcomes. We're coming to that. E is strategic issues for the next 5 to 7 years. Well, in your self-study and as a site visitor, you'll see if they've established what the strategic issues are for the next 5 to 7 years, and if their current strategic plan was done in a process that was open and participatory, all of the requirements that come for that strategic plan. And you can make suggestions that in the next 5 to 7 years, as you start revising your strategic plan, you may want to be paying more attention to greater input from these types of groups or these other types of groups to help you focus your strategic plan. Okay? You will now get a chance to understand what the accreditation process is looking for in student learning outcomes assessment. My purpose today is to give you a sense of what it is you're looking at in a self-study and while you're on site about what the program has done in terms of assessing its student learning outcomes. Okay? So let's start off with some definitions and what the assessment is. Again, this is central to our task as educators, I believe, is the assessment of student learning. Not the assessment of our teaching, but the assessment of students' learning. As educators, we care about learning. As teachers, we care about our process of being teachers. But as educators, we care about learning. And I think it changes for some of us the way we think. That student learning is the focus, and that all the stuff that is often within the instructor's control are simply the means to the end. The way you structure the course, the curriculum that you are a part of, your expertise as an instructor, quality of the students that come into your classroom. You know, I mean, sometimes you have such good students, you're just doing a little bit of honing on the edge on what they know, because they're already really good students. Others, you're really going from here and getting them up to here. Others, you're going from here and getting them up to here. But it really, this notion of focusing on learning really can flip the way some of us have thought historically into a little different direction. And this is a definition, I think this is pretty darn close to the definition in the PAB standards, that say that student learning outcomes clearly state the expected knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and habits of the mind that students are expected to acquire at an institution of higher education. Now that is the statement from this thing called the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. It proves you can form an organization about anything. Okay, and there is. NILOA, National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. By the way, if you're interested in this, they have a free website, newsletter. You can get emails from them about new publications that come out. I get them. It's weird. I do. I like this stuff. And I think it's really interesting. They're talking about new ways to help faculty create better course-level student learning outcomes. They talk about impediments to programs doing good learning outcomes and assessments of them, all sorts of things. But the key here is they state the expectations for what students will learn in a variety of areas by the time they leave that institution. So no surprise, the standards, the accreditation standards, capture the knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, values that planners need to have by the time they go out into practice. The standards state the object of the sentence. They state the knowledge, what the knowledge is. They don't state what students are supposed to be able to do to it? Do they just repeat it? Do they memorize it? Do they apply it? Do they synthesize that knowledge across a variety of areas? So while student learning outcomes often can be a direct reflection of the accreditation standards in the curriculum section, they have to be massaged. They can't be just those because there's no verb associated with those things, so you have no way of measuring them. I can measure whether students have memorized things. I can measure whether they have applied things. But can I measure whether they know something? Not directly. I have to measure whether they've memorized it, whether they've applied it, whether they can demonstrate their knowledge through application. But to just simply measure a knowledge of the structure and form of human settlements, not going to happen. Okay? So, for practitioners, I often ask them to think about some of your best entry-level planners. What is the knowledge, skills, values, competencies, predispositions that those individuals have? And isn't that what you'd like to see? What they can tell you, what they know, what they can do, what they can demonstrate to you. For educators, I always try to think of some of the best students that I had graduated out of my program in the last several years. That's where I want my students to be. Okay, what skills did they have? How did they incorporate the knowledge that they'd gotten in one course to a project in a different course? That's the cool part, okay? What did they know? What could they do? And what values, both professional and personal, and dispositions did they exhibit? So just another graphic about the same knowledge, skills, values, ethics, and competencies or experience in doing. What influences your program level student learning outcomes? So at the program level, what influences that? Well, I'd say it's your program mission and vision. It's what graduates are expected to do and where you expect them to go once they finish your program. Current needs and future expectations of the profession. And then, oh, by the way, the PAB standards affect those. So the learning outcomes across all of the institutions of planning education in the country shouldn't look the same. They might have some similar factors because of this, but based on your own program's assessment of the future of planning, practice, and competency, where you want your graduates to go and what you expect them to do when they get there and what your mission is, should make them feel different. So how do programs plan to achieve those learning outcomes? Well, they develop courses with certain content and syllabi and assignments. They have faculty with expertise and qualifications. They have student quality and ability. They have student activities during the program. They have curriculum, content, and structure. All of those are the inputs designed to achieve those outcomes. And all of those are necessary ingredients and recipe to get to that gourmet meal of what you define as the learning outcomes for your students. Therefore, curriculum, courses, activities provide the opportunity to learn for students, but it's incumbent upon you to have to demonstrate that students actually learned. So your job as a site visitor is to look for 4 things in that student learning outcome assessment process. The program has to have a set of student learning outcomes at the program level, not for each course, but they need it for each course to get to the program level and vice versa. But at the program level, what are their student learning outcomes and what's the level of performance benchmark they want to achieve for each of those learning outcomes. Secondly, they have to have a curriculum map. And in the old days, we always had a curriculum map in our self-studies. It was called the curriculum matrix, and we had all of the criteria and all of the courses, and you put an X in everything of your courses. And for some reason, it was always important that you fill that thing with as many X's as you could, which suggests to me you have a lot of repetitive courses. Or you do a lot of development of all those things in all those courses. Or you have faculty who think they're doing everything in your curriculum in their course, and so they just filled them all. So fewer X's is better, because it's actually saying, I am holding the instructor of that course accountable to achieving that learning outcome. All of a sudden, a lot of those X's will start disappearing then. Okay? From your folks who have wanted to be on that map. You also have to have identification of measures or evidence about student learning that will be collected and how. We'll talk about that. And then a schedule for collecting that evidence and using the results. So how do you collect it? How do you summarize it? How do you discuss it? And then how does that turn into improvements in the way students learn while they're in your program? Okay. You're seeing a lot of similarities in the structure of both the program improvement and student learning improvement. Same sorts of things going on. You have to state what you want to achieve. You've got to state how you're doing it, whether it's through a curriculum map or through the logic of your actions. You then have to measure what you have achieved and then say, what are you going to do with those results? And is it where you wanted it to be? So those are the 4 things that you're going to be looking for. So let's look at some learning outcomes. They are specific items that a program expects a student to develop, learn, or master during their degree completion process, and they include those classic 5 areas. This is yet another author in the world of student learning outcomes assessment. They establish at the program level what you want students to know at the end of the program and what you want them to be able to do at the end of the program. But student learning outcomes have to have 3 elements, and this is where the PAB standards aren't student learning outcomes. They are categories of learning outcomes. They have to specify an action by the students that's observable. They have to specify an action by the students that is measurable. And it has to specify an action that is done by the student. Okay. And that's the sort of thing that you're going to use in your lens as a site visitor to look at their learning outcomes at the program level and say, are those observable, measurable, or done by the student? The format of a student learning outcome is the following. There's lots of different ways you can do this, but they have to have 2 elements. They have to have an action verb and a something. Now, these somethings often are what's in the PAB standards. You know, they have to know about professional ethics. That's the something. But what do you want in your program students to do with professional ethics? Do you want them to demonstrate their knowledge of that professional ethics? And they could do so by assignments where they look at scenarios of ethics case studies and discuss them, write a paper, a short paper about it that the instructor reviews, and says, wow, they did great. Or the ones who didn't, there's something that needs to be done to work on that. But to just say they need students, by the time students leave our program, they'll know professional ethics. Don't know what to do with that. The first sheet behind the stack of slides, the handout of the slides, the first sheet behind that is kind of a buff color, and that's the Bloom's action verbs. All the way back in 1954, this genius put together this taxonomy of action verbs. And they go, the cool thing about this is that it goes from lower order skills thinking to higher order thinking. So for someone to go from memorizing to discovering and designing something that synthesizes that material is a developmental process. And so in the program's student learning outcomes, they should be very clear that they're using the right action verb that they really mean. Is it about application of knowledge? Is it about, let me see for just a second. So they have knowledge, they have comprehension. So knowledge is can they regurgitate it back to you? Comprehension is do they actually understand it? Can they apply it? Can they analyze it? Can they synthesize it? And then can they evaluate it? These are classic, and honest to Pete, I have this taped to my desk because, first of all, I'm not good at synonyms, and I'll just use describe, 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 describe over and over again, which is fine, but I don't really mean that. But then it gives you some synonyms and really help you think about what is it you want students to be able to do by the time they leave your program. So I leave that with you just because it's a great resource, and everybody that does outcomes assessment has Bloom's taxonomy. There's some people who hate it, by the way, just so you know that. Some people hate it. I tend to like it, but that's just me, okay? Student learning outcomes are defined for courses in the curriculum, but they are also defined at the overall program level. And that's the focus of outcomes assessment for site visitors is clearly you have to have course level outcomes to fill in the matrix, but it's really about the program level ones that you're going to be reviewing at this stage. There's no set number of how many there should be. I don't know, typically 5 to 7. Each one often has 2 to 5 subparts. The fewer, the easier to measure. The more, the clearer what it is you want students to learn and demonstrate by the time they leave your program. So it's kind of somewhere in the middle. And let me show you some examples. These are actually examples of ones that I've been working on with programs in planning around the country. And it's ones that have been generated. I'm going to show you the high level outcome. For each of these, there were between 3 or 7 sub-outcomes that really are the things that you can measure. These aren't very measurable, and you'll see why in just a second, because they have multiple prongs to them. But develop and refine individual and professional practices that support a lifelong career in planning and advocacy. That's the prepare you to be a successful planner for the whole time of your career. And under this, it was know how to work in groups, know what to do with ethical dilemmas and how to address them. I mean, I'm not using the action verb thing, but just to give you the content area that's under this. But in this case, it's develop and refine those practices. So that's what these sub-outcomes would capture. Okay? Another one is apply lessons from planning history and theory to current conditions and challenges of diverse urban settings. Okay? I pulled this one out because it's talking about the mission of this program. The program for which this was written is about what really captures its mission by stating this. Okay. This is clearly a criterion of the standards, the curriculum standards. And so there, that's an easy crosswalk. But this is saying who they are as a program. So it's really saying this is, for our mission, how we're bringing this in. And then this third one, this is just, here you go. Construct, articulate, and defend. Okay, now if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, that is lots of different levels there and lots of high-level stuff. A community-based process of advocacy and change to achieve a more just, equitable, and sustainable community. Okay. Now, this is a program that's chosen to use this one to define its overall purpose in life. And therefore, the rest of the learning outcomes are ways by which the program thinks they get students to that point. They have chosen to lead with that as their first learning outcome, which from a get students excited about your program, that's probably the best thing to do. But it's kind of backward when you read them, because then all of a sudden now you step back to saying, well, how do you describe the current conditions? How do you define what future you want? What is the pathway to change? And then how do you have those professional skills to be able to do this for the rest of the career? So, but you're seeing things that, yes, they're based on the standards, but they're authentic to the institution. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Second element of the curriculum of the student learning outcomes assessment is the assessment, and the assessment plan is the curriculum map. And this links course level learning outcomes to the program learning outcomes. It also identifies where your learning outcomes are expected, so that if you're not achieving your program level learning outcome, you know what courses to look at and to start working through, which might suddenly produce lots of erased X's on your old curriculum matrix to now your new curriculum map. Okay. So I'll just give you a sense of the general format of these. You've got all your course titles and numbers across the top here in the columns. You have your student learning outcomes. You may have an upper level one with the measurable ones underneath here. Oops, geez Louise. Why do I do that all the time? The various sub ones under here, and then another major one, and sub ones under here, and then X's throughout here saying that it's covered in those courses. I've been working with a program that decided to do I, introduced in the course, D, developed in the course, and then A, assessed in the course as part of the program's assessment of student learning. Kind of cool, yeah. So here's an example of one. This is applying general planning, knowledge of law, economics, blah, 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 in the creation of blah, 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 just, prosperous, resilient communities. So here's the sub-outcome. So can they find, read, and comprehend academic and professional planning literature and engage in debate about the issues that they raise? It's covered in these 5 courses. And it will be, in this case, they did an A, it'll be assessed here and again here. And this is in the sequential nature of the curriculum. Therefore, you could do a preliminary assessment here, and if you're not really hitting where you want it to be, you can really focus more in these courses to where you can then make sure you're really hitting it out of the park by the time you get to the end. Okay? What's interesting is that this learning outcome can be assessed in one course, or 2 courses, or 3, 4, 5, but it only really needs to be assessed in one. It could be assessed in every course that it's being offered, but you really would like to make this as efficient as possible, so there's no need to assess it in all of them. You could, as a program, really focus on this end, and then if you're coming up short, then go back to this one. And then if you're having troubles there, then go back to the courses that are supposed to be doing the introductory work. So it's kind of a cool, makes logic of your curriculum. Third thing is you need to measure and provide evidence about what the students have learned. This is probably the part that makes everybody wring their hands. So we're going to do it quickly, just to point to things that are important to be thinking about. They need to be measures of learning that are applied to student work. They can't be, well, we covered these chapters in this course from this book, and we all know that's the seminal book in this area, so therefore they know it. There are other criteria that require an alumni survey, which are self-reflections on what students learned and how they were prepared for their first jobs, those sorts of things. Self-reported information, we know its challenges and its strengths. I wouldn't put all my eggs in the self-reported basket. Okay? And it's students evaluating their own level of achievement, which I'm never comfortable with either. So it needs to be measures of learning that are applied to actual student work. But this is also important and required for program improvement. So don't just assume that an alumni survey is the way you get to student learning outcomes assessment. Just wanted to put that in here. So the direct measures, they are the most valid. The application of a rubric to a project or a paper. Okay. Rubrics, we all know about rubrics. Oh, we didn't hand those out. We'll hand them out on the break. I have an example of a rubric that is developed by, actually it's right up here, developed by AAC&U, Association of American Colleges and Universities. And rubrics are really cool because what they do is they have the learning outcome stated here. They have benchmarks of achievement across the top. And then they have text in each of those cells that describes what student work at that level of achievement for that learning outcome would look like. So you could imagine you would have one that's below acceptable, more than acceptable, outstanding, or below what's acceptable, close to acceptable, you can do as many categories as you want, columns in that rubric. And the idea is to make sure it's a good measure, meaning it's reproducible. You could give it to 5 different people and they'd come up with relatively good, consistent assessments of the same student's work. But it specifies what you want students to provide in the work that they do for that particular learning outcome. Rubrics, I think, are what's being used probably the most common, especially in graduate education. And then often applying them to end products, capstone projects, studio experiences, those sorts of things. You can also ask field supervisors about their ratings of the level of student knowledge or capability for different learning outcomes, because they are an objective observer of a student's work in a setting outside the classroom. So you could do a survey of field supervisors of internships. You could do a survey of employers of your graduates about how well they have those graduates as entry-level people demonstrated those different learning. Or you can take test items. You can take a particular question, an essay question, apply a rubric to it, and use that as a measure. It's an item of student work for which a rubric is applied to get a measure of the quality of that student's work. Similarly, you can use scores and pass rates on licensure exams, AICP, certification exams. You can use those, and you can get those scores broken out by different sections too. So you can find out if they're doing poorly on the law part, but overall they still passed. You know, you can get that sort of stuff. I point to these not to suggest you should use them, but to say, here are some of the issues associated with these measures. The literature says having a direct measure is really good, and then maybe easy to obtain corroborative information on indirect measures is also a good thing to do. So indirect measures, course grades, I can't tell you how many times I've fought, literally, argued with people about, well, if the student passes the course, then they learned what I wanted them to learn in that course. No. Well, why not? Well, what is included in the student's grade? Do you include attendance and or participation in discussions? If you do, what does that have to do with learning? So maybe they were there all semester long and didn't learn a section of the course. So they offset their grade by good attendance and good participation and never achieved one of the learning outcomes of the course. So grades are summative measures. They are a single point in time measure that accumulates knowledge of student performance in a variety of areas and therefore by themselves are not necessarily good direct measures of student learning. But they can be corroborative measures. Honors and awards and scholarships that students get, yeah, but there's uncertainty in the criteria that are used most of the time in those honors and awards. Unless you can establish that criteria, certainty probably doesn't work. Surveys, there's nothing wrong with asking an exit survey of students about what their opinions were, and you have to recognize this as their opinion, about whether they learned different program level learning outcomes and or how satisfied they were with that part of the curriculum. The student self-rating is the same, and alumni satisfaction, again, the word satisfaction is subjective, and so you get into all sorts of difficulties, not in what you're measuring, but how valid that measure is. Okay? Make sense? So those are the two sets of things that you can use. I think what I've seen in most programs that I've been working with, they're looking at rubrics, exam, AICP exam, and maybe a test question or two out of a key course that is like the one course that really hammers that learning, you know, example, law. You know, a lot of us have law courses, and in that law course we expect to have knowledge of the law, which is one of the criteria, not directly, but one of them. And then process issues come up in there too, in the law course. So there may be an exam question, a paper that's written in that course, and it's okay to have the faculty member assess and score with a rubric how students are doing in that course and then report it back to the full faculty to help them understand how students are achieving that particular outcome. As long as that's what you've put on your curriculum map and that's the course you've decided to assess for those outcomes. So the fourth thing is a schedule for collecting that evidence using the results to improve student learning. So there needs to be a time, I would suggest annually, that the program gets together and looks at their student learning outcome assessment results, discusses them, figures out how they're doing, what's not working, what's working, and puts together a plan of action on how to move forward. And if not, then we're having some problems with the last part of all of this assessment process, which is then what do you do with the assessment? How do you turn those results into action that leads to improvement? So you'll see that then measuring student learning outcomes is valid measures and then benchmarks of level of performance, a schedule and a method. From whom is that, from whom do you collect information about their assessments of the student work? How often is that done? How many? Do you do everybody in the course? Do you ever do a random sample of 5? Those are all kind of design questions for which there's no direct answer. Then when the results are summarized, is there a discussion, and then what is the action that's required as a result of that? So the work of site visitors, First of all, do they have learning outcomes? And are they really learning outcomes? Do they have an action, verb, and an object? Are they appropriate to the program and its mission? Or are they just cookie cutter ones taken straight out of PAB? Which is fine, but you can make it mission specific. How are the outcomes measured? Are they appropriate and valid? Is there an assessment plan that says we're going to measure these courses this term, or this course this term, this course the following term? In the fall at a retreat, we're going to review the results of those 2 assessments, have a conversation as a faculty about what that means, and talk about what changes might need to be made in other parts of our curriculum to get there. Or what changes need to be made to the rubric to capture what our students are learning better, because our measurement scheme had some flaws in it. That's fine. This is a work in progress. This isn't the end of the world here. And then finally, is there a feedback loop for improvement that's included in the student learning outcomes assessment? And that feedback loop could be everything from, do we need to rethink our curriculum? Do we need to revise the course content? I'm going from extreme to not extreme. So, or do we just need to celebrate, God, our students are really good. And they can demonstrate it by the work products that they produce, as evaluated either by our faculty, by the instructors of the courses, by outside practitioners who come in and sit down for an afternoon and review 5 of the students' theses or professional papers. And they review it for writing quality, blah, blah, you know, for a variety of the different learning outcome measures, perhaps using a rubric. And now you've got a, quote, more objective outside observer coming in and reviewing your students' work based on standards that you define that they can understand and absorb, okay? So, now I will state what my learning outcomes were for this session. Remember I said what the purpose was for the overall site visitor training, but let me tell you what my learning outcomes are for you. Site visitors will, action, verb, noun, will distinguish between program improvement goals and outcome measures. So each of you, if I were to measure you and assess how well both I did and you did, I would ask questions about can you make that can you distinguish between a program improvement goal and a student learning outcome, and the fact that those are 2 separate outcome assessment processes. Can you distinguish between a learning outcome and measures for that outcome? In other words, what the statement of the outcome is versus how you would actually measure that outcome. Can you, action, verb, defend the need for defining and measuring outcomes? Can you defend why it is that we define and measure outcomes now in higher education? And then, can you apply a critical eye to the use of assessment results in improvement? Can you look at what a program has done, what it saw in its assessment results, and what it's deciding to do in the future about what it learned from those assessment results? And can you apply a critical eye to that? Can you say, yeah, looks like you're just doing it and writing it down, goes on the shelf, and the program director never shares it with anybody or sends it out in an email and nobody ever talks about it and life goes on? Or is it actually the focus of a conversation of the parties involved in achieving those learning outcomes? Okay? So site visitors will be able to do all of those things.